Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Venegoni. Here we have conversations with artists, healers, and activists who enliven the LGBTQ communities and who empower our queer spirits to flourish. Before we start the interview, I'd like to offer you a gift. I work with many queer folks who struggle with self-esteem, self-acceptance, and confidence. And I get it. Growing up queer is no cakewalk. Living in a world filled with homophobia and oppression can take its toll. Having the strength to be true to yourself can be a challenge, but you can change that. So, if you'd like support taking the first few steps, head over to my website and grab your free copy of The Self-Confident Queer. Just go to queerhealingjourneys.com/confident. This guide will walk you through 3 simple steps to help you begin to build your self-worth and confidence today. So head over to queerhealingjourneys.com/confident and download your free guide today. Okay, now on with the show. My guest today is Jacoby Ballard. Jacoby is a yoga and Buddhism teacher with over 20 years of experience working at the intersection of social justice, trauma, and embodied practice. He has taught in prisons, schools, hospitals, recovery centers, and offices. He has also led a co-yoga teacher training and co-founded a worker-owned cooperative healing justice center in Brooklyn. His first book is released November 16th, A Queer Dharma, Yoga and Meditations for Liberation. Today, Jacoby shares with us how he stumbled into yoga and meditation by chance while in school. He shares how those practices have been supportive to him as a queer person and an activist. Jacoby also shares with us about his new book and the importance of understanding the history of cultural appropriation and capitalism in the yoga industry. Find him online at jacobyballard.net, and you can also get his book at bookshop.org. Hi, Jacoby. Welcome to the Queer Spirit Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick.
So you have this great book coming out that I want to talk about, which is A Queer Dharma, Yoga and Meditations for Liberation. But before we dive into your book, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you first came to discover and start practicing Buddhism and yoga.
Sure, yeah. I grew up in a small mountain town in Colorado, and my high school was doing, one of the clubs that I was a part of was doing a pilot of a senior project they wanted the next year to institute for all seniors. And so I just kind of out of the blue chose meditation. And at that time, I had been bullied for being seen as queer since 7th grade. And it helped me get through that to tap into something internally that can't be tampered with or messed with. My locker could be messed with, my body could be messed with, but there's something inside. And I was also a 3-sport athlete, and it made my basketball game better, specifically my free throws. So I became the player on the court that at the end of the game, when it was tight, we tried to get me fouled because I had a pretty great percentage rate. So, you know, especially with the sports, it helped me do what I was already doing better and more effectively. And that intrigued me, you know, like I wouldn't have thought starting meditation that it was going to improve my basketball game, but it did. And so then I got curious, like, what else is this going to do for me?
What is this magic?
Totally. And that tradition, it was a Hindu meditation teacher that I met, but she also did use some Buddhist practices as well. And then in college, I had a wellness credit, and I procrastinated on it because I didn't want to go to like this lecture or that lecture. Like it just felt like pretty cheesy. And then I got an email from the registrar that was like, okay, it's the end of your sophomore year. You haven't done this wellness credit. You're not going to graduate in 2 years unless you take yoga right now. With this 70-year-old woman named Lillian. And man, I'm so lucky that Lillian was my teacher because she had picked up the practice when she was 50. So she'd been practicing for 20 years, which is a pretty depth of practice, but had only picked it up when she was 50, when she was like pretty established in her life. And it had totally transformed everything for her. And so she was teaching from that place and also taught yoga as the whole Eightfold Path, the 8 spokes of yoga, and not just asana. so I'm grateful for that. Like I remember her teaching me about different kinds of foods and bringing foods to our sessions. And like, I think I ate quinoa for the first time with Lillian, like foods that are just like normal to me now. But then also asana was intriguing to me because she could do with her 70-year-old body things that I couldn't do with my 20-year-old athletic body. And I was just like, what? Confounded and felt challenged. And the sports athlete part of me was like competitive and like, I'm going to beat you, Lillian. But it kept me practicing asana, which was good. You know, it's an entry door for many of us into yoga, especially in the US. And then she also at the same time was like teaching the deeper practices. And I just kind of stuck with it and then got an opportunity to teach really just a year later. I didn't actually take a teacher training before I taught a class myself, which I would not recommend. And thank goodness I didn't harm anyone. But I started teaching a few regular weekly classes for students at my college and then started teaching a class that was just for university administrators. And that's what really hooked me into teaching because it was a class all of women and they would bring just such real life things to the class and talk about it. Like someone's son was suicidal or someone was going through a divorce or someone came into yoga to prepare her for a hysterectomy. Or, you know, just like real life stuff the college students that I was teaching weren't bringing necessarily. And I felt so honored that they would bring that to my class and lay it on the mat and allow me to work with it and work with them. And I saw the goodness that it created in those circumstances, that it allowed them a resilience, that it also allowed me through those difficult life circumstances.
So it sounds like you learned pretty early on and through that experience that yoga was not just about physical exercise.
Oh, yeah.
So would you say it was through that experience or through your teachings, you know, as becoming a teacher or both, that you started to open up a little bit more to the ways that Western and American culture have started to cut off these other limbs of yoga?
I mean, I learned meditation first, right? Which is half of the path of the 8 spokes of yoga in different levels, withdrawal of the senses and concentration, meditation, and liberation. So that's what I started with. So, and then Lillian immediately connected asana practice with meditation. She also was a Zen Buddhist practitioner and ran a Sunday morning meditation group that I became a part of as well. That was an 8 a.m. meditation group on Sunday mornings, not a prime hour for college students, but allowed me like a sangha and a community that was not on campus. And that also felt really important to my sense of like what sangha is, you know, that it was pretty diverse in that like there's a woodworker and there's a plumber and there is a university administrator and there's one other student that I brought and he eventually developed his own practice and commitment to being there. There's a poetry professor and we were all there to practice together, and it really taught me what sangha can be, which I now know through my Buddhist practice is like one of the gems, you know, to take refuge in the sangha, and it really deepened and expanded my practice then. So I think for me, asana practice was compelling, of course, because I was athletic and had a relationship with my body. I had a harmful relationship with my body that was like always pushing, always forcing, go faster, go harder, go more, lift more. But so yoga helped me like slow that down and be gentler and listen. But yoga was never just asana to me. And I feel really grateful for that.
Yeah. So a quick vocabulary check. Can you share with us what asana is for those of us who may not be familiar?
Yeah. Asana is the Sanskrit word for postures.
So the different postures and stuff that are most commonly seen when people think about yoga and the different movements and physical exercises and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. Generally, when people take pictures of people doing yoga, they're taking pictures of asana. They're not taking pictures of pranayama, breath practice, or not taking pictures of you reaching liberation.
Yeah. I'd be curious to know what that looks like.
I know.
So I'm also curious to know, as a queer person, how it was for you as you started to move into the yoga world and how that felt for you? I mean, I don't know where you were geographically, so that probably had something to do with it or contributed to what your experience was, but I'm just curious to know what that experience was like for you.
Yeah. So I was bullied for being seen as queer in high school, but I'm also a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, and so wasn't really in my sexual self in those years. So wasn't yet queer identified, but was bullied for being seen as queer. And then in college, I mean, a lot happened. I was studying with yoga with Lillian, and I was getting involved in social justice work and coming out as queer all at once. So it was like all part of my life. Yoga, I don't know if it necessarily helped me it probably did help me come out as queer. In my recollection, it was more through activism and being around other queer folks and being like, oh my gosh, I'm attracted to this person. Look at that. But yoga probably helped me accept myself at that moment. And then being queer in yoga for a long time, I think I didn't see myself mirrored. Mm-hmm. I didn't see other people that looked like me teaching or even often doing yoga, which is part of the reason that I created Queer and Trans Yoga in 2006, starting at the New York City LGBT Center and then branching out from there. And I've been teaching it as a weekly class since then. I started that because I wanted other queer folks to have a space to practice where our identities, our life experiences were known and witnessed and anticipated, and there wasn't anything to explain. I've been in so many classes where there's the gender binary is present. And so it's like women hold your hands like this and men hold your hands like this, or, women's shoulders are like this and men's hips are like this. And it's just, first of all, it's not even true for cisgender identified people. Our bodies are all vast and diverse. So it's limiting, that idea is limiting to all of us. And as a trans person, it felt like it was just dividing my body down the middle. Should I just then switch my hands, left, right, what should I do? Or my hips, they are quite open, and I'm also not a dancer, so I don't have dancer's hips. There's lots of moments like that, or moments of teachers saying hey ladies, as they greet a group of people, or, just being not seen or witnessed. And that was, right next to comments where they were racist or culturally appropriative, or so I think through my queer identity, being in yoga spaces, have been always acutely aware of how oppression is also present in the yoga classroom.
Yeah. So let's move into the book, because I imagine that conversation sort of leads us there. But tell us a little bit about this book, or give our listeners a brief synopsis, and what inspired you to write it.
Yeah, a Queer Dharma, it's kind of half an exploration of the heart teachings of the Brahma Viharas, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And then I put in there letting go, anger, working with anger and forgiveness, because whenever I teach the Brahma Viharas, that inevitably comes up. And some of the early readers of my book were like, okay, I can work towards forgiving, but right now I'm just really pissed. So what do I do with that? And so I was like, oh, right. We need to talk about discharging anger before we ever get to forgiveness, of course. So half of the book is on the heart teachings and, as experienced through my own queer life and that of my students, and with, social justice references, which I'm seeing more and more of yoga and Buddhist teachers, but still not as frequently as I would like. Mm-hmm. And then the other half of the book is both a critique on mainstream yoga and a vision for an actually liberatory form of yoga that we can live into. And where the book started from was really my queer and trans yoga classes, and people asking me, why queer and trans yoga? Why is that necessary? Isn't that exclusive? Isn't that perpetuating division? Right? And affinity spaces are often critiqued like that or misunderstood as that. Whereas the intention is so that we're mirrored and can open up our bodies and our hearts and our minds. And when we're under attack and experiencing microaggressions in the very space that we come to for refuge, that's just not going to happen, or it's going to be very slow to happen, or someone's going to leave the practice because, man, that teacher's racist, or man, that teacher offered something really transphobic. I don't want to go back. I don't want to subject myself to that. So the book began as a response to all those people, why queer and trans yoga? And then also people asking, like, what's different about this class? Like, is queer and trans yoga different than how you would teach like a vigorous yoga class or a gentle yoga class? And my answer was yes and no. Like, the context is different, right? Like, I'm referencing queer culture. I'm like anticipating that some folks in the room are going through like their first queer relationships, and some folks in the room are going through breakups in the midst of a small community, and some folks in the room are being harassed for who they are. And that's just like not always the case for straight folks. And then another one of the intentions of queer and trans yoga has been to create a space where queer folks can be heartfelt and embodied with each other in community. Because I was finding that like I often go to like queer events that are like political or about, you know, going out and dancing and getting down with each other. And there wasn't at the time that as much space for like being in the body, but not necessarily sexualizing at that moment. Not that sexualizing is bad. I love sexy queer culture, and there's more to our bodies than that. Or where we could like really be with our vulnerabilities and our hearts and like talk about what we're working on as human beings to be more present and engaged and purposeful in our lives.
Great. So by realizing that you needed to bring in some trauma-informed information into the classes, it sounds like you started to realize that it was more complex than maybe what you had been originally taught in your teacher training in terms of what needed to be brought into the class.
Yeah, and I think it always is going to be, because right now yoga teacher trainings are just 200-hour version and a 300-hour version beyond that. And some places offer a 1,000-hour version, and there's 2 programs in the country that offer a PhD, which is great. And I think like that's really, and I say this in the book, where I think if we're going to be responsible with this practice and responsible to the history of this practice, that we need a greater depth of study, because if you only get 200 hours of training and then you're expected to hold the bodies and the hearts and the life experiences and the ancestral trauma and resilience of the beings in the room, like that's just too much to ask, and it's kind of setting ourselves up for failure. And plenty of yoga teachers get that feedback, right, of like what we don't know or what we're not doing or the gaps in our knowing. And I think in that moment we can employ our own practice to be like, oh yes, is what this person is saying true? And if it's true, what a gift. Like, thank you for seeing that and offering that back to me. And if it's not true, if I've actually studied that, or you're just having a reaction to my teaching and how I'm offering it, like that's yours.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. But yeah, I think I've definitely become a more skillful teacher over time, and have now like taught, over the 10,000 hour mark. So have a familiarity now at this point, after teaching for 20 plus years, like pretty capable of what anyone might bring into the classroom, that I can work with it. I'm not threatened by it. I've probably lived through it myself or helped other students through it. I know teachings that can work with that fear or anger or attachment or jealousy or whatever it is that's creating suffering that someone might be working with.
Yeah, well, what I like about the book, speaking of it, there being these PhD programs and, really doing justice to knowing exactly what it is you're getting into, that your book sort of gives us a quick snapshot of that, of all those pieces that I think that we're missing, particularly, Western white people who are practicing this and not getting all that other information in terms of the history. Like one of the things I didn't realize that you talk about in the book is the way that the Hindu right in India has also appropriated yoga, and that, people don't realize that yoga and Hinduism are not the same thing, that they are separate things that have some overlap, and the same that Buddhism overlaps with it too. And part of that has to do with the complex cultural and religious history of India. But there's also, a complex social political history of it too. And so I really enjoyed that you brought that in. But I wonder also if you could talk a little bit about what I think is one of the most important things in terms of the 8 limbs of yoga and the foundation about the yamas and the niyamas, in terms of bringing that both to yourself and out into the world.
First, I want to speak to the cultural appropriation bit just for a moment. I think that one of the results of the extraction of asana from the whole of the yogic path, and then the extraction of yoga from the context of India, results in not knowing, for example, that International Yoga Day came out of the Hindu rite. And now we practice yoga in downtowns of major cities on September 21st, not knowing that we're actually what we're reinforcing in doing that. And I think that very much connects to the yamas and niyamas, right? Like one of the yamas are the ethical practices. I think of them as like wise ways to be in relationship in the world. And then the niyamas, the daily observances, so the ways that we nourish and nurture ourselves so that we can show up well for relationship in the world and our path. One of the yamas is asteya, non-stealing, and has a direct application to cultural appropriation, right? That to not just extract this practice from the history of India, from the land of India, from the people of India, and how can, for me as a white practitioner without an ancestral connection to yoga or Buddhism, how can I, and also making an income, making a living off of these teachings, it's a regular part of my practice to dedicate income back to India and organizations here in the US led by folks of color and people of South Asian descent as like a practice of asteya, that like, thank you for giving me the practice. It literally saved my life. In order to keep that energy flowing, I need to offer something back to the people that it came from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'll just speak for myself and maybe a couple other personal conversations I've had with friends, but, you know, as a white person in America and a queer person, I feel like, you know, what's important as we look at how we bring more consciousness to our own cultural appropriation with these practices, be it Buddhism or yoga or Hinduism or any of those things, is that, you know, a lot of queer people have felt like excommunicated from their church or their family or their religious or spiritual community because of their identity. And, you know, straight people may feel the same way who just don't resonate with the religion or the spiritual practice they were brought up with. But, you know, people of European descent, we also have our own spiritual ancestry and history that was erased, even more so than most of these other cultures, because there's no trace of it or very little trace of it whatsoever, which is what I think a lot of modern day pagans are trying to reach back into and, you know, creating things that work for them. And I think that, you know, a term that sort of came to me is this idea of feeling like a spiritual orphan, right? Like I felt like I don't like the spiritual practice that I had genetically, historically, ancestrally was taken from me so long ago. I have no idea what that was. And it's something that I long for. And so because, you know, the history of white people is all about colonizing and just taking and appropriating, like that's just in our blood. We don't even know that we're doing it. And like it goes so far back that it just feels like, okay, so it's okay to just like take this, that, and the other without sort of thinking about what happened to these other people. So I think important thing, especially for white folks, is to really look at the grief that they may have of that loss.
Yeah.
And addressing that grief and knowing that we can use these practices from these other cultures with respect, with honor, with mindfulness to help us heal our grief, and maybe use that or find something that just works for us, but to bring awareness to it.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought up that history. And I write about it in the book that if it weren't for white supremacy and colonization, I wouldn't have encountered yoga. And if it weren't for my own ancestors not passing down our spiritual practices, our ethnic foods, I would have then had something. And in the book, I'm so grateful for yoga for saving my life, because my ancestors failed me in that. My family spiritual traditions failed me. They were evacuated. We assimilated to become white. And so then as a young queer kid, I'm like grappling and dealing with so much harm every day that I go to school, and I have nothing. And so thank God, it just feels like such a blessing that I encountered meditation in that moment, and then yoga, And how dare I not then give back to those traditions that saved my life? And that also involves like, making sure that in conferences that I teach at, that there's also South Asian teachers teaching there, and more than one, or listening to the various calls of South Asian teachers that invite us to practice the whole of yoga, not just asana, and to know the political context of yoga so that we're not reinforcing harm or how the Hindu rite is taking it up. That feels so important. And also what the very teachings are directing us to do. The very first teachings is to be harmless.
Yeah.
In the world. And so to be harmless with ourselves, for me, like as a trans person, as a queer person, even as a white person, like how do I love myself so that I don't have to perpetuate this legacy of continuing to take? And how do I then like pass that down to my child and future generations, that like we have something to dwell upon and resource us in moments of duress.
So can you give our listeners a little taste of some of the ideas that you bring forward in your book about how to start to change some of these ways of relating to these practices and traditions from out of a capitalistic and cultural appropriation perspective?
Yeah. The first half of the book is all about the heart teachings, and they're found both in the Yoga Sutras and in Buddhist lineages, which compelled me and often compels me when I'm teaching anything. If like multiple spiritual traditions talk about this, that I think that like this is just a wise human practice, and people from different parts of the world have come to it. And so there's some energy behind it. So one of the things that I use to measure the efficacy of my spiritual practice is if my relationships are getting better. And when I started studying the Brahma Viharas in around 2010, my relationships started getting better. I was working I co-founded Third Root Community Health Center in Brooklyn, and one of the people that I started the cooperative with remarked to me like several years later, probably 5 years after we founded the place, and a few years after I had begun the heart practices, that I was just becoming a kinder person and less judgmental and less forceful and less using tools of guilt and shame to get someone to do something. And that like, I just so remember that reflection from Angela as being so important that I hadn't gotten actually previously in so many years of studying yoga. So the heart teachings were helping me be a better person in the world. And then also helping me in my social justice work where, when we're called out or called in, what are some of the practices that we could turn to in that moment, like compassion or loving kindness, to like trust our basic goodness, to turn our awareness to the impact of the harm created and try to create repair in whatever way we can, and know that that's like not instantaneous and it's probably going to be a long-term process. And then to be committed to the repair through practices of forgiveness, and to work through the grief and work through the anger as part of that practice. And also, I think of the practices of joy. It was such a delight to write a chapter on joy in a Queer Dharma and talk about queer joy and all the beautiful ways that we are with each other. There's so many times that I'm in conversations with straight friends, and I realize that they don't have what I have because they don't have the community that I have, right? So like we show up for each other. We fly across the country for each other when someone dies. We, bring food. Like we show up as family does, as community does. And we know how to do that because we've been doing it every day for however long we've been in queer community. And straight folks don't necessarily have that because of heterosexism and the heteronormative family structure and the capitalist notion of independence. I'm writing a chapter on joy, and felt really important in this book. The experience of being queer is not at all just an experience of oppression, right? It's an experience of creativity and vision and imagination. Like if one partner doesn't work, like what is going to be the like relationship structure? Like we can create it and be responsible with each other, and all the work that we're doing in the world too.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. There's a lot of freedom that comes with being queer, I think, which can be a little unclear at first as you're maturing. Like, well, if I'm not going to do that, then what do I do? You get to create your own way, but you have to like come up with it, right? But I find it really helpful, especially in my work, when I have straight clients who are like, well, you know, my wife doesn't do this, or my husband doesn't do that, or what am I supposed to do? And it's just like, well, just because that's what your family does or the history of straight people have done doesn't mean that you have to do that. They're like, what? I can think outside the box. I can do something different. You know, well, what will they think? Well, if it doesn't work for you, who cares what they think? Right? Challenge their thinking for them. Challenge your thinking. So, yeah.
Yeah, that we can like cast aside like what will other people think, because we've been judged by what other people think. So we know that that's a tool of harm, and that there's so much more beauty and creation on letting go of that and finding our own way, whether it's through a spiritual path or in our chosen family structures or how we do the work that we do.
So, Jacoby, before we wrap up, I wonder if you can share with us a person, practice, or experience that has supported your queer spirit to flourish.
Yeah, I think I want to share today, and I write about it in my book, my chapter on anger and sustainability, some practices working with anger. There's so much going on in our world. There's so much suffering, and so many people, so many communities are targeted. For me, anytime I turn on the news, no matter how progressive the news site is, there's always anger-making material. There's plenty of anger to work with these days. And it feels really important to speak about it here, because anger is often not welcomed into spiritual practices. There can be a fear around it or a stigma of it, that like, that's not spiritual. Like, your practice isn't that deep if you're just getting angry at what's happening in Afghanistan or whatever. But I know that anger is a sign that something is wrong. And that's really important internal knowing. And underneath that, right, is the heartfelt sense that there is suffering here. And oh my goodness. And then that something precious is being assaulted or killed or destroyed in some way. And so then our sense of protection comes up to protect that which is precious to us. So what I work with in dealing with anger is any kind of discharge practice. So I want to invite listeners to think about, how do you move the energy of anger? Because it's a very physical experience. Some examples might be going to a batting cage, or boxing, or even our yoga asana practice. A vigorous practice can really allow us to move that energy through. Because once we move the energy through, then we can allow the wisdom of anger to speak. And once we've moved the energy through, then my body language and the tone of my voice is no longer threatening. So that the person that I'm speaking to, the institution, the policymaker that I'm speaking to, can actually hear what I have to say and not just be like automatically on the defenses because they see my red face and the steam coming out of my head and the like forward hunch of my shoulders. So it can, just tapping the body can be a discharge practice, any kind of physical release, dancing, stomping, movement of the body, and to do it really intentionally when anger comes up, to just like remind yourself that like this is something that's available to you. Because if we don't move it, if we don't discharge it, then it gets stuck in our body, right? And then we become like that angry queer person, the angry fill in the blank person. And any targeted community has the stereotype of that because we're targeted and there's a lot to be angry about. But then we allow the wisdom of our community to come forth and present itself. So thinking about any of those discharge practices that you might work with, and to do that before you might even attempt to like think about compassion or think about loving kindness or equanimity, to know that that energy needs to be moved and released so that it doesn't cause a war inside of your own body, heart, mind, a war inside of your own community, inside of your own household. Like that energy is going to move in some way and often cause some destruction unless you let it out intentionally. So I think that's what I would offer to listeners.
Great. Thank you. And since you brought it up, I'm just going to give a shout out to a book called Love and Rage by Lama Rod Owens, who's a queer Black Buddhist teacher. So folks can check that out if they want more resources on that, as well as in your book.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, so it's coming out just this week on November 16th. And where can people find your book and connect with you online?
You can find it at your independent bookstore or bookshop.com, which supports independent bookstores, or IndieBound, or if you have to, any of the other book giants. You can follow me on Instagram at Jacoby Ballard, or find me on my website, jacobyballard.net.
Okay, great. Well, I will also have those links in the show notes so people can find them there too.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here, and I look forward to diving deeper into your book, and thank you for bringing this wisdom out into the world for us.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's been a joy.
To find the resources we discussed today, find the show notes at thequeerspirit.com. And if you enjoyed the show, remember to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. This will help us reach and support more queer people all over. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.